This is honestly mind-boggling that this has gotten by this far without serious action from the feds or from the RCMP. All eyes on Migma. Through collective action, we've launched a campaign, and this is something that a lot of people are paying attention to.
I respect the right to protest as it's their right to protest. However, when you're blocking access to the boats and the wharf, that becomes infringement on our legally affirmed treaty rights. So that Constitution protects our inherent rights to do what we are doing. Like, what we are doing is not illegal at all. We have been legally affirmed in court.
This is genuinely like, it's our first episode. So thank you so much for joining us on here.
Welcome to the New Action Podcast. I'm Alfred Bergeson, a member of the Prime Minister's Youth Council and the founder of Collective Action.
And I'm Tristan Olaf, the co-founder and managing director of Nouvelle News, a youth-driven news and media platform amplifying stories that matter.
We are young activists, and we have conversations about topics, people, and events in the world today.
Conversations that explore important stories and hopefully inspire action. If you enjoy our podcast, subscribe, give us a rating, and follow us on social media.
So why don't we jump into this, Tristan? What have you heard? And I know you've been covering what's going on in Nova Scotia through Nouvelle News. What has your team picked up from the story?
It's definitely an interesting story, one that I think started off with a lot of coverage on social media, and then subsequently some news stories that came out that sort of gave this perspective of sort of both sides conflict. But generally what was being heard was that there were Migma fishermen who were trying to go out and fish, and they were being stopped from doing so by settler non-Indigenous fishermen. I think that the biggest thing that we've seen really has just been this escalation of events, something that started out with Migma fisher traps being taken out of the water, and then Migma fishermen being blockaded and their boats being blockaded and not being able to leave the harbor.
Yeah.
And then just a sort of further and further escalation. What did the sort of coverage look like for you in Nova Scotia?
Dude, it's crazy that, the first thing I saw regarding this issue was about a month ago. I was on Facebook and I saw that someone that I'm friends with on Facebook shared a live stream. And so I tuned into this live stream, and it was a young fisherman who was arriving to the wharf to fish, and there were hundreds of cars on his way in. And the moment he got out the car, he was confronted by a crowd of, let's say, I don't know, what seemed to be maybe 200 people, 200 non-Indigenous fishermen who were making a whole lot of noise. And the guy who was streaming live on Facebook, I mean, he kept his composure quite well. I mean, it's definitely, I can't believe how well he kept his composure, because he was definitely being threatened right off the gate. From seeing that, I was quite surprised by what was happening, and initially I thought this is something that might pass in a day or two. However, I think that was on a Wednesday when I saw that, and by Saturday or Sunday, there were more reports of non-Indigenous fishermen cutting the buoy lines in the water and ramming other boats on the water, which was just blew my mind that this is happening right now. Social media definitely became a place where people were sharing a lot of the information, because at that time, the media honestly wasn't covering a great deal of it. And so a lot of the insight that I got in terms of what was happening was primarily from social media.
I think that what this crisis has highlighted, and especially the initial coverage around this crisis, is a fundamental deficiency of knowledge amongst a lot of the Canadian public when it comes to understanding treaty rights. So to give a little bit of background, as the coverage has come out, and some facts on the situation, what has been taking place is that the Migma fishermen have a right to earn what is sort of referred to as moderate livelihood from fishing. Now, the history of this goes quite a long way back. It first started with the treaties of peace and friendship which was signed between the governor of Nova Scotia and local Indigenous leaders around 1760. And in this case, both parties agreed to certain trade limitations from Mi'kmaq hunting and fishing activities. Now, obviously, with the ambiguities that surround these historic treaty rights, a case was brought up to the Supreme Court in 1999. And there, the Supreme Court affirmed this right in a ruling involving a Mi'kmaq fisherman named Donald Marshall Jr., who had actually been charged for fishing and selling eels without a license outside of fishing season. And so what this Supreme Court decision affirmed was that the fishermen, in accordance with this treaty that was signed in the 1700s, have the right to earn a moderate livelihood from fishing in waters at any time of the year. Now, what has happened more recently is that the in this Mi'kmaq nation in Nova Scotia of Sipekne'knatik, they look to basically create their own self-regulated lobster fishery, which would allow the Mi'kmaq fishers to go out, set some of their own traps, obviously within a moderate, a moderate amount, catch their fish and sell it. Obviously, something which is even more necessary right now during a time of COVID, when people, a lot of people, especially people in poverty, are struggling to get by and make a livelihood. And so therefore, a perfect time to put it into action, this right to earn a moderate livelihood. So turning it back to you, Alfred, in terms of what I've just kind of said there, as someone, living in Nova Scotia, do you feel like this right to earning a moderate livelihood as it relates to fishing is something that's quite well known? Was it something that you knew about before this particular crisis came to be?
It is. I knew about it because I had Indigenous friends growing up and people who would hunt and fish, but I didn't know the details of this. I wasn't educated about the treaty rights in school, and I certainly wasn't educated about the right to, moderate livelihood in my schooling years as well. So it's something that I've picked up growing up, but I think there's an onus on our education system to share. This is a part of Canada's history, and the fact that there's a large percentage of the population that doesn't know the rights that Mi'kmaq and Indigenous people have in Canada, I think that's a failure of our education system in Canada. I'm not sure how the Canadian government can play a role in that, but certainly I think education is held by the provinces, and if this is not something that they've done in the past, I certainly think it's something that they need to look at is educating students in the law and as well as in the rights of Indigenous peoples, because they were here before anyone else was. They were here before Canada was colonized and Turtle Island became Canada.
I mean, from my perspective, having not gone to high school, it wasn't something that I learned. And so all of this was sort of very much new to me. What I found...
Wait, you didn't go to high school? What do you mean?
I didn't go to high school in Canada. I went to high school in South Africa.
Right.
No, I just kind of skipped a few steps. I spent some. So when I first heard about this crisis, I went and learned some of these things. But what kind of surprised me was that the fact that this right to earn a moderate livelihood, whilst it was affirmed through this 1999 Supreme Court decision, it actually hasn't been sort of signed into law by the government of Canada.
Really?
No. So, and that I'm pretty sure from the research that I've done. But what that has done is that it allows for a huge amount of ambiguity, especially as it relates to, in this case, with the sort of the mob violence that we've been seeing. The RCMP haven't necessarily understood how to react, but also in the past, we've seen Department of Fisheries and Oceans officers who have blatantly ignored this right to earn a moderate livelihood from fishing, and oftentimes harassed fishermen and fishers in general, tampered with their catches and whatnot. And so, I think that's one of the difficulties too, is that there are still these treaty rights that exist, and some that have been affirmed by the courts, but their language hasn't actually been implemented into Canadian law. So it does kind of bring us back to, different actions that can be taken from this. And the biggest issue that that this has had is that the reason why this crisis has gone on for over a month is that there's just been continuous escalation. And unfortunately, escalation happens when there's no consequences for these initial actions. And so kind of looking at the way that this has all gone down, if you have these fishers who are obviously, to give them, I think, some, representation to a certain extent, like they are jealous that they are not allowed to fish outside of the, the fishing seasons. But having said that, these fishers have also seen in the past DFO officers go out and harass Migma fishers and take away their traps and take away their catches. And so in a way, it seems like they were emboldened by that kind of behavior that had been tolerated for many decades, or at least since 1999, to go do the same and kind of take law into their own hands, which obviously was wrong because, as we've said multiple times, the Migma fishermen had rights. But this escalation went further and further. So first it was taking down traps, then it was blockading fishermen, and then we got to a point where Migma fishermen's boats were being burnt down. And now, just over the past couple of days, there's been even more escalation. So, what have you kind of heard on, over the past couple of days? What have you sort of heard on your end, and where do you think this is going to go now?
Yeah, this is honestly mind-boggling that this has gotten by this far without serious action from the feds or from the RCMP. In the last few days, like you said, there's been a van that's been on fire, boats set on fire, the gear of indigenous fisher people getting damaged by non-indigenous fishermen. They're still trying to set blockades with spikes on the road. And this is all happening while the RCMP stands there and essentially protects the non-indigenous peoples. They're not arresting anybody. They're not intervening to stop the harassment and the damage that's being done right now. And so I think, when it comes down to it, our RCMP really needs to step up. And from the top down, from our prime minister down to the RCMP commissioner, I think Canada needs to truly denounce this, but also take action to make this right and take action to protect the Mi'kmaq fisher people. This is huge. All eyes are on Mi'kma'ki. You've been reporting this through Nouvelle News, through Collective Action. We've launched a campaign. We launched a campaign about a week after the first incident. And, this is something that a lot of people are paying attention to. If you want to take action, visit collectiveaction.ca and look up the Take Action to Protect Mi'kmaq Rights to Fish campaign. The letter that was created was done by community members here in Nova Scotia, and they have three main asks. And number one is for the government to uphold the rule of law and respect treaty rights. The second is to address the threats, attacks, and discrimination against Mi'kmaq peoples, including from DFO officials who have unjustly criminalized Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters. And the last one is to ensure the safety and security of Mi'kmaq people as they exercise their legal treaty rights. So this is a campaign on collectiveaction.ca, and you can go there and enter your information to take action, to add your voice, and to send this to the relevant government elected officials. So far, we've had about 6,000 people. Today, we had 6,000 people have taken action and have added their voice to this. So this is clearly something that, people are noticing something needs to change. And I think from the Mi'kmaq community end, while, protecting them and ensuring the safety of them right now is crucial, there's also negotiations happening currently around what does a moderate livelihood actually mean? What is the definition of moderate livelihood? So I know that this is something that is, the government and the Mi'kmaq Nation is negotiating on. I wish I could speak more to it, but I don't know enough about it.
Yeah. Well, I think, two things to sort of add on there. Number one, there needs to be action. As we said, the harassment of Migma fishers as they attempt to go out and earn a moderate livelihood from their land, from their waters, has been challenged for many years. And I read this fascinating story on APTN News about a fisher named Marilyn Lee Francis, who back 2 years ago, herself was going out by herself, putting out about 8 traps every once in a while to catch a small catch of lobsters. And herself was just being harassed. She would come back at the end of the day. She would look for her traps. They weren't there. She would go back and she would find them all sitting outside the DFO offices with no justification.
That is so wild, man.
It really is. It really is. And so, and this is kind of what's happened here is that because there's been, no action in the past, what the Migma fishermen have now done is, they're using, trying to sort of use their, sort of solidarity to protect themselves and in creating their own self-regulated fishery. So that they can go out together and not face the same kind of discrimination you get when you're going out by yourself. And sort of to the second point, there has to be something that's done at the federal level. The language of the 1999 Supreme Court decision, needs to be in some way incorporated into law so that there isn't this ambiguity. And I think in our first episode of the New Action podcast, one thing that I mentioned was the difference when it comes to people in positions of power between reaction to events and actual concrete action. And I want to sort of take a moment and just sort of talk about what we've been hearing about this from people, at the highest level. We have Bernadette Jordan, who is the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. She put out a statement yesterday on the 14th of October saying, "I'm appalled by the reported events in Digby County last night. I strongly condemn the actions of every individual who destroyed property, committed violence, or uttered threats." And then what we heard from the Prime Minister later on was a quote tweet of that, which says, "The acts of violence and intimidation committed in Digby County yesterday are unacceptable, and I join Minister Jordan in strongly condemning them. We cannot continue down this path. We must work together to advance reconciliation and implement First Nation treaty rights." Now, these might, sound like, statements of strength, but they are reaction. And if it doesn't go further than this, then it is an abdication of the need for reaction at the highest level to stop these kinds of escalations. Because at the end of the day, we are lucky that no Mi'kmaq fishermen have been seriously harmed. And if nothing happens, this might be the case.
Yeah. Listen, man, I think, in situations like this, and, I'm also watching what's happening in Nigeria right now with police brutality. When people are protesting and when, people are getting hurt and when things are getting damaged and the government does not intervene to protect citizens, like, there's got to be some sort of global organization that can intervene and hold our government accountable. So it's sad to see, but hopefully, we're a month in now and it's only gotten worse, and I think we're at its peak, and I hope we're at its peak, and I hope that in the following days we have a resolution. On this episode, we have Brooke Willis join us. Brooke is a Migma young woman who has been speaking up a lot about the issue. I've been following her on social media, and I've been getting a lot of my information from her. She's been on the front lines, sharing pictures and videos of what's happening, but also sharing ways in which people can support their efforts. All eyes on Mi'kmaq. Enjoy our conversation with Brooke.
Well, thank you for having me. It is truly an honor to be able to speak from my own experiences, and not only my own experiences, but my family's experience, my community's experience, and my Mi'kmaq Nation's experience. So I just wanted to start off by saying, as mentioned, my name is Brooke Willis, and I'm actually coming live from my Migma community of Sipekne'knatik First Nation. And with that being said, I would like to honor my ancestors by acknowledging that I am on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of Mi'kmaq, which is known as present-day Nova Scotia. And I'd also like to acknowledge my grandfather, the late Chief Reg Maloney, who fought hard to protect our inherent rights. I think it's important to have the youth's perspective out there as well, because, you know, I'm talking here today as a rights holder, as a young Mi'kmaq woman who has been directly impacted. My brothers are fishers, my father's a fisherman, my cousins are fishermen, my community's fishermen, and my nation. So we've been here since time immemorial, and the fact that we're still here in 2020 and having to discuss these issues, it's really eye-opening to see how people are, I guess, involved in this, and how there's a differences of perspectives on what people think and what is like factual points and stuff.
Can you help our audience better understand the crisis? Can you explain to us what has been going on and what has led to Mi'kmaq chiefs, declaring a state of emergency?
Okay, so to start off, on September 15th, my older brother and actually my other brother and my father and cousin and community members, just a regular day for them in the morning, trying to go exercise their inherent rights and get to the wharf to get out on the water. And they were met by an unexpected crowd that morning. And from what I've seen as I was viewing from my brother's live stream on Facebook, to me personally, it was a bit scary seeing that much people just there because they didn't want us to be doing what we're doing, basically. Yeah, it was scary to see, like, from a point of perspective, not at the wharf then. I respect the right to protest, as it's their right to protest. However, when you're blocking access to the boats and the wharf, that becomes infringement on our legally affirmed treaty rights. What I've seen from, I guess, media is that there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of confusion on what it means to have these treaty rights. So Mi'kmaq people, we are actually unique because we not only have treaty rights, but we have Aboriginal rights, which are protected by the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. So that Constitution protects our inherent rights to do what we are doing. Like, what we are doing is not illegal at all. We have been legally affirmed in court. And as recently as the Donald Marshall Jr. decision that was decided actually on September 17th, 1999, which is the 21st anniversary when my community of Sipekne'knatik launched their self-regulated fishery. And what people fail to recognize is we have a constitutional right to do what we're doing. We have the right to self-govern ourselves. And we've seen our Prime Minister Trudeau, we've seen him make multiple statements saying that, Indigenous peoples are one of the most important relationships that we have. And so I think it's important to note that our own Prime Minister has made statements saying that that's Canada's main priority to recognize and implement, or not necessarily recognize, because as mentioned, we've already had our rights recognized as recently as the Supreme Court of Canada Marshall decision. And so people fail to recognize that we're not doing this like out of intent to hurt anyone else's. We're just trying to, eat food at the table too and not take food from anyone else's table. Like, this is us trying to practice our tradition and, connect to our ancestors. This is a way for us to live off the land in our homeland of Mi'kmaq, or present day Nova Scotia. And we're not doing it just because we think we should be allowed to. We legally have been affirmed that we have this right. So it's a little disheartening to see that people still fail to recognize those decisions.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that you mentioned there sort of surrounded the sort of like the media narrative around the crisis there. And I think, from my perspective, running a sort of a youth-driven user organization, we're quite interested inside of that aspect. And so what we notice is that during some of these contemporary sort of First Nations crises that we've been seeing over the past couple of years, it's often the media that is the one to, sort of craft the narrative of what's going on. And often that can sort of undermine the perspective of, the Indigenous people on the ground. And so my sort of main question was sort of surrounding, it's kind of two parts. One, do you feel like there has been quite a big discrepancy in terms of what you've been sort of seeing and feeling on the ground compared to what you have been seeing is reported on in sort of national media? And the second part of it is, if you were the one who was kind of crafting the narrative from which people kind of understand what is going on there in your hometown, what would you hope is the big picture that the public would take away from the struggles that the fishers are facing in terms of protecting their right to fish?
I would like to see more people speaking, I guess, from a point that is neutral in a sense, because what I've been seeing as a young Mi'kmaq woman and, as mentioned, a rights holder, I've been seeing that there's kind of one narrative that is more at play here, and that is the one where I guess we're in a sense being questioned on our sovereignty, because Mi'kmaq people are actually a sovereign nation. And in order to sign a treaty, you need to be a sovereign nation. And so our treaties are actually internationally protected. And there have been studies done by the United Nations. So, so what I would like to see is people, I guess kind of taking into consideration both opinions or both perspectives, but factually educating on why the Mi'kmaq are doing what they're doing, because we're not doing this because we think we have a right. We have an inherent right to exercise our harvesting. And so what I would like to see is, kind of more, I guess, more factual evidence as opposed to one perspective, which is what we've been seeing, or what I've been noticing as a young Mi'kmaq woman on the front lines. And as mentioned, it is really disheartening to see the blatant racism and ignorance that is being displayed here in what is known as Nova Scotia today. So what I would like to see is, I guess, more people kind of respecting like why we're doing what we're doing. And it's important to recognize that we do have this right that is constitutionally protected. So it's not just something that is, we have to go through all these kind of hurdles to get there, but that's kind of what we're seeing. Like, I'm 23 and I'm the next generation from this Marshall decision. So I was 2 when this was going on, and my community, actually, there was another dispute in 2000, and it was again due to fishing and the lack of, I guess, kind of general education in a sense. So I guess I would like to see more education implemented throughout the province and the country, actually, on all Indigenous people's rights, specifically what a treaty right is and why Mi'kmaq or these nations, why do Indigenous nations have these rights to do what they do, and living more in that path of peace and friendship, of coexisting and respecting one another. That's been the main goal here all along: peace and friendship, coexist, live together and respect one another. But historically, as we've seen, it's kind of been one way or the other way. I'd like to see more education, and I would like to see, I guess, as a Mi'kmaq youth, a rights holder, I would like to see Treaty Day being a provincial holiday. So I think that, like we should have Treaty Day recognized as a provincial day where we all celebrate this, not just the Mi'kmaq people, or not just a handful of people who have an idea of who we are as a nation. So I think there's still some work to do when it comes to living and walking that path of reconciliation.
Thank you. It's not an easy question.
For sure.
That was really well said. I think, you know, as you mentioned earlier, our prime minister said the relationship with Indigenous peoples was his number one priority. And, the question is, are we as a country living that on a daily basis? And when we aren't, are our leaders speaking up to ensure that, the rest of the population is keeping that as our number one priority? I was watching your brother's Facebook Live and in disbelief, and I thought what was happening would be something that would take place in one day and be over. But a week later, there were still incidents happening. How have you've been on the front lines, and what have you been up to on the front lines, and how are youth in your community contributing to what's happening right now?
So I actually would like to start off by thanking you guys for reaching out once again, and to also give thanks to everyone else who has been standing up and standing in solidarity with us and recognizing and respecting our rights fully by giving us a voice. And my, I guess, kind of part in all of this has been trying to get my voice heard and my community's voice heard, and a lot of youth have also been doing the same. And it's not just the youth of my community, it's like the Migma Nation, the Willosto, even more, just like all Indigenous people across the nation. We've been getting messages of support, not only just Indigenous people, but allies as well, because those voices are just as important as ours. They're there helping us get our voices heard too. And so personally, as mentioned, I've been trying to get our voices heard, been trying to share the live streams, been trying to share them to different platforms on Facebook and just different platforms in general. It affects me so much, and it's not personally, but it's a collective. We as a whole, as a nation, and even as indigenous people, we're affected. So as seen, the Haudenosaunee are also facing issues with their sovereignty as well. So is the Wet'suwet'en out in the west, and then we have the tiny houses and some other things, some other nations who are heavily impacted by, I guess, the lack of respect for, I guess, our Aboriginal rights and not necessarily treaty rights, but, these rights to constitutional rights to implement our self-governance. So as mentioned, I've been just trying to get out there actively, help my family, my community, just help where I can and be kind of, I guess, used in any way that I can help. And I think what's important is every voice matters, and it's important to note that because, geez, I'm a community member. I don't have a big, huge title or role or anything in the community itself, and I'm just acting as a youth, a passionate, concerned youth about my future. And what really has also inspired me is I would like to acknowledge kind of a wise, knowledgeable woman, Pam Palmater. She's been someone I've been following as well, and she is very educated and knowledgeable in our treaty rights and our just rights to self-govern, as she currently sits as the co-chair, I believe it is, on the Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. So something she said in one of her YouTube videos that really stuck with me as a youth was, people always say the youth are the future. But she said that, the youth are actually the present. We have to protect the past, the future, and the present. So that has been something that has really stuck with me throughout all this as well, because as mentioned, I'm 23. I'm the next generation from the most recent affirmed case from the Supreme Court of Canada, Marshall decision in 1999. And we're still here trying to, get people to recognize that we're not doing this illegally. This is our legal affirmed right. So so I've just been trying to get out there as much as possible, trying to, like I said, just share other voices. And I just want to say thank you again for having me on your guys' podcast. I am truly honored. And it's awesome that you guys are just starting out. So I wish you the luck on your endeavors. I think you guys are going to do well. And I also want to say thank you to you guys for all your hard work that you do to, I guess, kind of fight social injustices. And yeah, thank you for all that you guys do as well.
No, of course, of course. Thank you so much for joining us. And there's definitely I'm sure it's the same for Alfred, but part of us that it can't be easy to be 23 and and kind of be on this like frontline environment, trying to do what you can to, like you said, protect your inherent rights and sort of, I think we both feel like you're doing a really great job, both online and agreeing to join us on the podcast and share your words and your wisdom and your story is really inspiring. And I think the thing that you really touched on there is oftentimes it's a matter of education, and just making sure that young people across the country and, as you said, the past, the future, and the present are understanding of, this really beautiful thing that is the treaty rights that exists within Canada, but just making sure that people have the education to be able to respect them and understand them and foster an environment of coexistence, like you said. So Brooke, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you and hear from you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Will Allen.
Will Allen, Brooke, take care. Have a good night.
Thank you. You guys as well.
That was an amazing conversation with Brooke Willis from Migma. Really appreciate her joining us to chat about what's happening right now. She's obviously very knowledgeable about what's going on, and as she mentioned, her brother is on the front lines. She's been on the front lines, and we're hoping that the issue that's going on right now is resolved in the coming days. Tristan, what are your reflections? What are your thoughts after talking with Brooke?
Yeah, like to sort of echo what you said, a really lovely interview and inspiring as well. But, also a little bit disappointing, that, young people like Brooke and her brother have to be so involved in this, in a crisis that is directly impacting their culture and their livelihoods. And yeah. So I had a couple of, takeaways there. I think the most pertinent one was something that Brooke mentioned in terms of calling for more neutral people to speak up. I think there's been a lot of support online, but there needs to be more. People have to show that they are watching and that they understand what's going on. They see the dynamics and they are angry that not enough action is taking place at the federal level and at the provincial level too. It's extremely important that the government knows that they will be held accountable if these sorts of Indigenous crises and these treaty right crises go unimpinged. And I think that brings me to sort of the second point, which is really that, there isn't a lot of sort of, gray areas in terms of what's going on here. It really brings us back to the theme which has dominated a lot of this year, which is a theme of systemic racism. In terms of what's going on here, there are groups of people who have a right to do what they're doing, and they are being targeted. There's mob actions of intimidation against them, and there's continuous escalation, and nothing is being done about it. But the RCMP was there, just 2 days ago, when 200 members of a mob, some of them fishermen, some of them other people from community, were surrounding a lobster fishery whilst Migma people were inside, and they pelted it with rocks. They were out there. This is, it's terrifying. And at the end of the day, there isn't justification for this. And I was reading about this, that up to in 2018, the Department of Fisheries website indicates that there were around about 979 licenses to fish in the area, most of which permitting around about 375 to 400 traps per license. Basically, what that means is that the entire Migma fishing sort of operation that's taking place here for moderate livelihoods represents around about as much as 2 commercial boats would take in. 2 commercial boats.
Wow.
And so the fishers are coming out here and they're saying, we're concerned about the ability for, the lobsters to reproduce, and they're angry that fishing takes place outside of season. First of all, they have that right. They have that right for moderate livelihood. The seasons do not do not impact that treaty right. But second of all, that whole argument is just not real, because it's just, if you compare it to the commercial fishing industry, it's just such a little amount. So those are my, my sort of main takeaways from that interview. And I just can't recommend for people enough to speak up, to use their platforms to, speak in solidarity and do what they can to encourage action. And as Brooke said, there is action that can take place. What were your thoughts, Alfred?
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well, and Brooke spoke really well on this issue. We also were planning on having Chief Mike Sack on this episode. We had an interview set up with him, and unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. But then later on, we saw on social media that Chief Mike Sack actually got in an altercation on the same day we wanted to do an interview with him. He got in an altercation with a non-Indigenous fisherman. And so, when a chief is going to the front lines to protect his rights, and non-Indigenous fishermen are harassing him and hitting him or attempting to hit him, and when the RCMP watches that without any sort of consequences for the person who's putting forward that harm, this is not good. This is not good. And so I don't know, I don't have much else to say other than if you want to add your voice to this, there's a collective action campaign online at collectiveaction.ca. You can add your voice to a list of demands that have been created, and hopefully by adding your voice, it will lead to change very soon, because this has been going on for too long and it needs to come to an end.
Yeah. And hopefully at some point we will get a chance to speak to Chief Mike Sack. Obviously he was the chief of the Sipekne'knatik First Nations out there, and he's trying to be a communicator. And some things that we've read that he said in the past days, he is calling for action. He says actions speak louder than words. And that is very much the case. And it was an issue that started out as a need for treaty rights to be affirmed, for RCMP officers and DFO to be better informed in terms of their need to protect these rights, which are affirmed by the Supreme Court. But because this hasn't taken place, because the escalation of this crisis hasn't been dealt with effectively by the authorities or the provincial or federal government, it's now not just a treaty rights crisis, it's a safety crisis. And these fishers are in need of protection. And that is the escalation. And that's what happens when these kinds of things aren't met with correct action. And, when the Indigenous people who are facing discrimination, they're facing attacks on their livelihood and on their rights, in this case, for moderate livelihoods, when the leaders don't stand up and use their platform and say, these fishers are allowed to do what they're doing and they should not be accosted, they should not be intimidated, this is what takes place. So if possible, everyone who can, sign the collective action petition, call on leaders to do what they can to speak louder, and let's keep doing what we can. Alfred, it's been a pleasure to record this first interview with you. A great first interview with Brooke also.
Yeah, and we finally got around to creating a social media. We have logos. You can find us online at New Action Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. And you can listen to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please give us a 5-star rating, follow us on social media, and share this with your friends. Maybe they don't know enough about this issue. Or maybe people are wondering how to find out more. Well, this podcast might be a medium to find out more about the issue. So please share this with your friends and take action if you can. Take care.
If you enjoy our podcast, subscribe, give us a rating, and follow us on social media.